Welcome. Glad to see so many people out to see Jimmy Blankenship. As you probably already know, you are in for a big treat. I've spoken with Jimmy on the phone a couple of times, and he's nothing but knowledge. It's fascinating to talk with him. He's a brilliant man, and I'm so thrilled that he's here. So I will properly introduce you to him through his bio. Jimmy Blankenship worked for the National Park Service for more than 36 years, with 33 years at Petersburg National Battlefield, where he was the historian from 1992 to 2014. He also worked at Colonial National Historical Park, Jamestown and Yorktown, and at Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia. He had many temporary duty assignments at many other national parks. He retired from the United States Army Center of Military History in 2020, where he served as the director of the U.S. Army Ordnance Training Support Facility. So Jimmy comes with quite an interesting full resume, and I proudly introduce to you Jimmy Blankenship.
Thank you very much. Okay, I just found out earlier that I'm going to be recorded and taped, so I cannot say a lot of stuff that would be funny and stuff like that, but I will try to do some of it. All right, City Point goes back to, well, the first people here were Native Americans, of course. We've got evidence of them back here as far as 12,000 or earlier, 12,000 BC or earlier. The English colonies, or the English showed up. John Smith went riding by in a boat. He didn't stop, but he went riding by in 1607. And then City Point per se was established in 1613 by Sir Thomas Dale. At that time, it was not called City Point. It was called Charles City Point. And when Charles City was not on this side of the James, it became Prince George around 1702. And that's when you drop off the word Charles and you get City Point. So that's how the name came about. Now, the Revolutionary War was here briefly in 1781. The Epps family got here as early as 1635. And then the Civil War begins, and there was some action here in 1862. The Union Navy came up the river, shelled City Point at least 12 different times. They occupied City Point in 1862. In August, Lee moves up to what became the Battle of Second Manassas, or Second Bull Run. And that's when the Federals leave City Point and do not return until May of '64. In May of '64, Butler is doing the Bermuda 100 campaign. He's trying to take Richmond, but Union troops land here in May of '64. And so that's when City Point was occupied by the Federals and remained under Federal occupation until the war is over with. I'm going to concentrate on City Point, 1864-65. Okay, this is an early map of City Point. This is around 1837. I put this in just to show that it was not a booming town by any means. There are a few wharfs here. The point up there is where the Epps house is, Appomattox Plantation or Appomattox Manor. And so it's not a lot of people here. By 1860, there were about 300 people living in City Point, so it's not a booming town. What put City Point out of business as far as a port goes were the railroads. So it was a very busy port in the 1600s, the 1700s, and even the very early 1800s. But with the railroads coming in, there was no longer a need for vessels to come up here to City Point. All the small ports up on the James River ceased to exist because Richmond still had a port. So City Point was kind of not a hopping place by the time of the Civil War. This is another drawing of City Point. This is up on top of the bluff right here. This is Prince Henry Street. Back then, I think that, I can't read what it says offhand, but 1844, it was still a small little place. Whoops. And then this is a plat that the Epps family had done in 1857. I just put it in here because there are a few wharfs right here. But when the Federals actually get here in June of '64, It's described as a kind of a rundown place, a few rickety old wharfs. Whoops. Now let me tell you why Grant came here. Grant initially wanted to take Richmond, so he does what's called the Overland Campaign. He starts up outside of Fredericksburg with the Battle of the Wilderness. Lee gets between Grant and Richmond. Grant goes around Lee. Lee gets back in front of Grant, and you have the next battle, Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Then you have Totopotomoy Creek. Then you have Cold Harbor, and that's when Grant decides to go for Petersburg. The reason he goes for Petersburg is that Petersburg had the railroads coming in. So Lee's supplies were coming in by rail to Petersburg, and then from Petersburg his supplies would be dispersed from there. So Grant figured if he could get Petersburg and cut those rail lines, he could stop Lee from getting supplies and hopefully end this war. Now, you can see this is the north side of Appomattox Plantation, and you can see it's damaged. These are cannonball holes from the U.S. Navy back in 1862. The Federals first shelled the east side of the house, then they shelled the north side. They're basically coming up the James, and then they turned and went up the Appomattox and shelled the west side of the house. The only side of the house they did not shell was the south side of the house, and that's because the rivers didn't go that way. Now, this house is the second house on the location. The earlier house was built in the 1600s. The center part of this house between those two chimneys is 1763. A wing was added on this end, 1840. A wing at the other end, a couple of additions on the west wing in the 1850s. So you can see the state of the house when the Federals arrived in June of 64. You can see the grounds are kind of not well kept because Epps had fled the plantation in 1862. He returned for a short period of time in 1863. But then when the Bermuda 100 campaign gets going, he goes back to Petersburg. This is the east side of the house, and this photo I put in here because there were shell damage up here. You can see a window's blown out. There are cannonball holes on the side of the house. These are big pieces of canvas that the Federals put up there as a temporary cover for the roof, because one man did decide to use the house, and it was not Grant. Grant did not use the house because he planned on a short, quick summer campaign. He did not want to have the appearance of a long, drawn-out campaign. So Grant stayed out in the yard. He used a big hospital tent as his headquarters. Another angle showing those canvas covers on the roof, and you can see how jungle-like the grounds look at that point in time. And then here's a view with the roof fixed, no canvas. They've even put a window back in where one had been blown out. And the man that did use Appomattox, the house himself, was the chief quartermaster for the armies operating against Richmond. That means the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James. This man's name was Rufus Ingalls. So he's in charge of the Union supply system. This is how the Union system worked. A regiment, the regimental quartermaster at the lowest level would send in orders for what he's going to need for the following month. They go up to the brigade headquarters. That guy compiles them. It goes up to the division headquarters. The division quartermaster compiles them, and it goes up to the corps quartermaster. And then the corps quartermaster send them to the Army quartermaster, like the Army of the James quartermaster, the Army of the Potomac quartermaster. And then they send them up to Montgomery Meigs up in Washington, D.C., the chief quartermaster for all the U.S. Army. Well, he's responsible for collecting all this material, and then it's collected, and then it goes back down that chain of command until a wagon from a regimental quartermaster either goes to the railroad to pick up his supplies, or the supplies are taken to that quartermaster by wagon. So that's how it operated. Oh, and I came across in a letter written by an infantry commander. He said, as usual, the quartermasters have appropriated the finest residence in town. So I can say that one. And this is the north side of the house once it's been all fixed up by the Federals. This is the spring of 1865. You can see the trees are blooming. The early spring trees are blooming there. Now, this is a rare photo. This was sent to me by Noel Harrison. He still works at Fredericksburg. He found this, I think it's the National Archives, and it just said village. Well, he sent it to me. He said he wanted me to look at this and see if I could identify the location. Well, I could right away, because some of these houses still exist over in City Point. If you know where Bonnecourt is, the brick building, that's Bonnecourt right there. This is the Christopher Proctor house right on the corner of Pecan and Prince Henry Avenue. These houses don't exist anymore. This is the house where Jimmy Micklem lived, and then this one doesn't exist. No, this is the City Tavern. This is the one known as the Tavern today, right there. So I recognize this photo right away. What happened was the photographer actually hauled a couple of 100 pounds of equipment up into the signal tower that was on top of St. John's Church. And so he took this view. Now, if he's going to go through all that labor of hauling that stuff up there, you would think he would take more than 1 or 2 photos. He probably did, but I've never found them. So he probably took a shot looking this way, that's the James River. He probably took a shot to the east. He probably took a shot to the west, but I never found them. But that's a really fascinating photo. And this is Brown Avenue right here, what's now Brown Avenue. And that's the little house. I don't remember who lived there. I know who lived there in the Civil War. It was General Collis. He was the post commander. And there's a story when Lincoln was in town. Lincoln was walking around with his wife, and they just happened to pop into Collis's house. And Collis and his wife were laying on the floor in front of the fireplace eating chestnuts. Well, very improper behavior to be caught doing in the Victorian days. So they both jump up and try to get themselves, straightened up and all that kind of thing. And Lincoln goes, relax, relax. I wish I could do that. Now this is Grant's headquarters, just a tent. This is Grant right here with the straw hat in his lap. No, wait a minute, this is Grant. Yeah, that is Grant right there. And Grant was a very down-to-earth kind of guy. He failed at almost everything before the Civil War started. In 1860, he was a sales clerk in a harness shop. And I used to tell this story to the school kids that came out to City Point. In 1860-61, he's a sales clerk. Well, he did have previous military experience. He joined up as a colonel. I think it was the 23rd Illinois. Well, Grant, who was a sales clerk in 1861, had a tremendous rise to the top of the pile. By 1864, he is in charge of all the armies of the Union Army. And then after the war, of course, he becomes president. So I would tell the kids, be careful how you treat park rangers, because you never know how far they might go someday. But you can see the camp equipment here. Now I know you can't see this probably, but this is a flag, and it's a Confederate flag. It's a captured Confederate battle flag. So Grant had that there just to remind him of what his purpose was. Now the command structure of the North and the South, the military command structure is totally, and the political, is totally different. Up north, everything is consolidated. Lincoln could pretty much have his way with the northern governors, and Grant could tell everybody what to do as far as all the various armies. He could control an army 1,000 miles away if he wanted to. Lee, on the other hand, and Jefferson Davis, the political and the military system is diffused. The states are in control. Davis cannot tell a state to do anything, and Lee is only in command of one Confederate army, the Army of Northern Virginia. The Confederate Congress in Richmond does not give Lee total command of all the Confederate armies until February of 1865, where there's nothing left to command by that point in time. So states' rights, which is what everybody says the war is about, worked against the Confederacy more than anything else except the Union Army. You need to have consolidation of power in a war. Now here's another shot of Grant. Notice the bench here. That bench is made out of naturally curving branches of a tree. And this chair back here, that's a fancy Victorian chair that most likely came out of the Epps house. Now here's the East Wing. This is the man, Rufus Ingalls in the middle. He's the chief quartermaster for the armies operating against Richmond. And notice the cannonball holes in the house up there. A couple of holes there. And these columns are actually cast iron columns. That was a fad in the 1850s. So the Epps had cast iron columns on their porch. On the north side of the house, if you go over there today, you will see a small section of one of the columns where it got hit by a cannon shell. And these naval shells were big shells. We found a 100-pounder Parrott shell out there. A man named Robert Parrott actually designed this type of a gun and type of a shell. So the Navy was shooting really big shells at Appomattox Plantation in 1862. And this is, I forgot what this was called. I think it's jasmine that was growing all over the place there. Elise Epps Cutchin, I knew her very well. And she had a lot of memories from her family. She was born in 1907. And I asked her, whenever I interview someone, I always ask them, what is your earliest memory? So I asked her. She thought for a second, and she said, refusing to stand on the spot where Joan of Arc was burned. I said, wow, that's a pretty cool story. So she and her family in 1910 had gone over by ship to visit England. But she remembered that. Now this is Ingalls' family and some other people. And women were not allowed into camp when the active fighting season is going on. So from June until about probably late November, early December, women are not in camp. Officers' wives are not allowed to show up. Well, Grant asked his chief of staff, John Rollins, what he thought about allowing women in camp. Rollins said, females in camp are a disruptive influence, is what he said. Well, the next morning or a few days later, Rollins looks out of his cabin and he sees Mrs. Grant and Mrs. Rollins coming across the yard. So much for keeping the ladies out of camp. Now the dog here, I actually have a story on that dog. That's a Dalmatian. And Grant once asked Ingalls what were his plans concerning that dog. Ingalls said, I plan to take him into Richmond with me. Grant fired back, well, I hope he comes from a long-lived breed. Grant was making a joke about how long it might take him to take Richmond. And that's Ingalls with his dog and Ingalls' personal horse right there. A lot of these photos have never been published. All right, this is the waterfront. This is the way the waterfront looked when the Federals arrived. There's not much there. The description, like I said, were a few rickety old wharfs. This is at low tide. And the shipping is there, but the wharfs, they have started building wharfs, but they haven't really gotten down this far on the waterfront. So when they arrived at City Point, when the wharfs and the buildings would all be constructed by the United States Military Railroad. And the Military Railroad had two departments. One was the Construction Corps. That was the biggest one because they built everything. The other division was the Transportation Corps. They are the engineers and the conductors and the people that actually run the trains. By the end of June, there were 873 workers with the Military Railroad. 833 of those 873 worked for the Construction Corps. So the bulk of them are workers, carpenters, people like that. So they first saw City Point, the waterfront. They said it was about 1,800 feet of open ground along the James River, but the width of it from the river's edge to the base of the bluff in some places was only 30 to 60 feet. That's not much room. Keep in mind, Grant is supplying an army that numbered anywhere from 60 to 100,000 men, depending on what time of year it was. And he's also supplying right around 63,000 horses and mules. So The horses and mules would consume 600 tons of fodder every single day. You cannot live off the land at that rate of consumption. There's not that much stuff out there. So they have to bring it with them. You have to supply the troops with everything, the food, the weapons, the ammunition. So this is going to turn into the biggest supply base in the field ever built during the Civil War. So the first thing Grant does, he orders wharfs to be built. And they just don't start with one. They start building a bunch of them at the same time. But the first wharf he wants built fast is the railroad wharf, because he needs to bring locomotives in and rolling stock, flatbed cars, box cars. Now here they are starting to build. You can see over here, they're starting to build right through here. But look at the shipping. The shipping's already here, but they're having, they need a place to unload everything. Fortunately for Grant, another reason he chose City Point was because the channel is right up against the shoreline. It's a perfect place to build a port. And he also chose City Point because of the City Point Railroad, which by 1864 was actually part of the South Side Railroad. But they called it the City Point Railroad. Now the City Point Railroad, the Confederates had removed the iron railing, the rails, and most of the cross ties were rotted out by 1864. And so for a distance of 4 miles from City Point out, there really was no railroad. Grant had to put a new railroad in. Now if you look at this U-shaped object right there, when I first came across this, I found a bunch of letters written by the chief engineer of the railroad department, and I also found a daily diary up in the National Archives. So that's the basis of a lot of my information. Well, it said they called it a gin. Well, I only knew of one type of gin. It was something that you drank. And obviously, this is not that type of gin. It's a gin for lifting heavy objects. So it's a pulley type system. And you can see there's a railroad car right there. So they had what they called track barges. Barges that they would lay railroad tracks on. You would drive the locomotives up or move the flatbed cars and all that up onto those barges. The barges would be pulled by steamers from Alexandria on the Potomac into the bay, down to Fort Monroe area, and then up the James River. So they had track barges, and that's how they moved the rail equipment in. One locomotive, the 440s, would weigh about 50,000 pounds. I found a letter written by a captain of a steamer who said that he did not like moving locomotives because of the weight. All that weight is on rails that are only 4 feet, 8.5 inches wide. That's a lot of weight, 25 tons in one spot on a barge or on a ship. So it's not easy to move that kind of weight around. But anyway, the barges would park right up here. They would start the locomotive up. It would just roll off the track on the barge, onto the track on the wharf, and you're ready to go. Eventually, they would have 26 locomotives at City Point, not all at the same time, but the total number that I found so far is about 26 locomotives were used at City Point. And these locomotives, if you've seen the old not Charlie Chaplin, but the old movie, shoot, I can't think, it's a comedian, Buster Keaton. It's called The General. That's the type of locomotives that they had here. Another early wharf construction, you can see the old wharfs right here, but you look at these pilings right, I mean not pilings, but look at these beams right here, how big these things are. And then they're working on the wharf up on the upper James, working their way down to the lower James. The next step is once you get the pilings put in and the stringers, then you lay the floor, the planking down. So this is just the process of building a wharf. But these are massive, massive wharfs. This is a very early wharf, so they've got everything down. They've got the pilings in, they got the stringers. These are the stringers, and then you put the planking down. Now, to get the pilings down into the mud flats, they actually had steam-operated pile drivers. So they had several of those, and they just do the same thing as we do today with a pile driver, except it operated off of a steam engine. And that's a 440 right there. You might recognize those type of locomotives from And they were actually pretty good locomotives. They could go as fast as 60 miles an hour, not on the City Point Railroad though. Another early wharf construction photo, but these are earlier buildings right here. These buildings pre-existed the war and the one up on the bluff right there. A combination, you got some barges, you got a steamer. Now on an average day at City Point, you could see about 240 vessels out there. Very busy port. It broke down to where you could see about 40 steamers, 75 sailing ships, and over 100 barges could be seen out there in the James River on an average day. Major, major port. Now this is later construction, so you get the planking down for the floors, and then you start building the warehouses, which are on the wharfs themselves. And look at this, they even had a railroad that was elevated. And this is on the other side of those buildings. These are steam coffee makers, believe it or not, because when you make coffee for an army, you got to make a lot of coffee. They also had a bakery set up at City Point. It consisted of 7 buildings. They had 2 railroad spurs that ran up to the bakery, and they could bake over 100,000 rations of bread every single day. Now there are some stories that the bread was still fresh when it made it to the front lines. Well, July and August, that really ain't much of a brag. But if that bread's warm out there in January and February, that's a pretty good brag. So imagine these Confederates smelling that bread coming across the lines. As far as I know, it never sparked an attack, but I'm sure they thought about it. Now this photograph was taken right on the point itself. So you can see some of the steamers and everything out there. But you can also see these guys right in the foreground here. They're taking a break. Another view from the point. That's Bermuda 100 on the other side of the river. And there was a small port over there. It couldn't have been so small because I found out that they had over I think it was over 3 million rations of forage for the horses. So what Grant would do, he would store lots of supplies at City Point. Not everything went out to the front immediately. Grant had stored enough food to feed the animals for 20 days. He had stored enough food to feed the troops for 30 days. The reason he did that was because what if Lee cut Grant's supply line? Highly unlikely, but still, if Lee had cut Grant's supply line, those rations would give Grant 20 to 30 days of time to reopen his supply line. And here's the other view from, no wait a minute, that's the same slide. Oh well, I thought I cleaned this thing up, but I didn't. Anyway, that's the view from on top of the church, the one I talked about earlier. Oh, there's the other one. So remember the first slide. Here's the brick house Bonaccord right here. The next slide shows to the left of that. That's why I put it in there, I think. Here's Bonaccord over here. This is Brown Avenue. That's the Porterhouse right there. And then it does not go far enough over to get Appomattox Plantation. It could have been the trees were blocking it, possibly, something like that. But they're the only 2 views I know of taken from up on top of the signal tower at the church. And that signal tower was actually built by the Confederates in '62. The Federals left it there once they took City Point. It really was not used as a signal tower by the Federals, though. They had the telegraph operation set up right away. Now this is Prince Henry Avenue. If you're looking down the street this way, you're looking straight down to Pecan Avenue where it goes down to the river. So this is the end looking up the other way, which is a dead-end street. This tavern does not exist anymore, but you can see what it looked like when the Federals were there. That's March of 1865. Now these are a couple of buildings up on top of the bluff. That's the Provost Marshal's office right there. He's basically the military police. And they did have trials there for federal soldiers accused of various crimes. Keep in mind, you could be hung for attempted rape back then. You didn't really have to do it, but you could be hung for attempted rape. They did execute, I believe it's 42 Union soldiers for desertion. The only description I know of, it was on a hill overlooking the big hospital the Federals had. One hill is where the old high school is right now, across the street from the football field, the sports stadium there, Maloney, I think it was called. That's one possibility for where they would actually do the executions. And they would bring out a few thousand Federal troops to witness these executions as a reminder, if you do what this guy did, this could happen to you. This is an old plantation out in what's called Mansion Hills today. It burned to the ground around 1925, but it's a very nice colonial house. This was the Mitchell plantation. It was also called Bull Hill, I believe. I just put that in there because it was a nice place, but also to show that the Federals occupied everything around here. There are a few other views of this house, some long distance, showing all the cows out there that the Federals had too. Grant would have herds of cattle follow the armies around so that they could have fresh beef on a regular basis. Now, this is the only known photograph of the Ordnance Wharf before the famous explosion took place. So keep in mind, this Ordnance Wharf ran parallel to the waterfront. And keep your eye on this chimney here and these two buildings. What happened was a Confederate, his name was John Maxwell. He worked for the Confederate Torpedo Department. Now, torpedo is not what we think of as a torpedo. It's not this thing that goes flying through the water and sinks ships. Torpedo was just an explosive device, a bomb that would blow up either in the water or submerged under the water. So a Confederate general named Gabriel Rains was in charge of the torpedo department, but John Maxwell worked for him. Well, Maxwell was told to go to City Point and see if he could do any damage. Maxwell had a device. He called it his horological torpedo. It just means time bomb. Let me tell you this story first. One day, it was a hot summer day in 1990, I was working at City Point. This little old lady comes up, knocks on the door. So she says, do you know anything about the explosion? I said, yeah, I know a lot about the explosion, and it's not the crater explosion, it's the one at City Point. She said, my grandfather did it. I said, your grandfather was John Maxwell? She said, yes. I said, well, come on in, I want to talk to you. So she comes in, and I asked her about him and all this kind of thing. And I asked her, well, what was he like? She was 90 years old at this point in time. And she would have been 16 when John Maxwell passed away in 1916. And I asked her, well, what was he like? And she said, he was just an old man. That's all she could think. You know, she couldn't say what he was like. He died in the old soldiers' home in Richmond, the old Confederate soldiers' home. But she had this device with her that he had made himself. So he made a horological bomb, basically, a time bomb. And what it was the inner workings of a clock, and a clock that you would probably wind up. It had a big spring in it, round spring. And he added two little components to it. He added a very powerful spring that when the alarm went off or whatever, when it hit a certain point, that spring would snap, and he had added a percussion cap device. A percussion cap is what you put on the musket so that when the hammer smashes that cap, it creates a spark. That spark goes down into the barrel of the musket, sets the powder on fire, and that throws the bullet out. So he added a percussion cap to it. And I had a Class A explosives expert show up one time. He said, this is a Class A, detonator. Anyway, the original was destroyed in the explosion. He had made another one. And let me go ahead with the explosion part, and then I'll complete that story. So keep your eye on that chimney and these two buildings. Well, you can see it. This is a drawing that was in a newspaper at the time. There's the building with the chimney. There's the other building. You can see this terrific explosion. There they are. This is after the explosion. So this has been destroyed. This building is still there, but damaged heavily. So the Ordnance Wharf what Maxwell did, he wrote a report about what he did in December of 1864. So he and his companion, a guy named R.K. Dillard, actually managed to sneak into the supply base area. He said what they did was they went east of Richmond, crossed over the James, and they were coming up from the east to City Point, and they were dressed as civilians. And so there were a lot of civilian workers from up north working at City Point, just like any military base today. Well, they get up close to Grant's headquarters, and the grass was real high, and said they crawled on their bellies between two pickets. A picket was a sentry. We would call them sentries. They got beyond, they passed the security line, and they were up on the bluff watching what was going on down below. Well, it's easy to spot the ordnance wharf because that's where you see all the cannons lined up out there and the ammunition crates and all that kind of thing. So Maxwell said he waited until the captain of an ordnance barge left the barge and came up on top of the bluff. Maxwell said he went down to the barge and he had a wooden box, and that's what he had his torpedo, his horological torpedo in. I've seen two accounts. One said with 12 pounds of powder in it, and the other one said 14 pounds of powder. Well, a guard on the barge confronts him. What are you doing here? Maxwell basically says the captain ordered this aboard, and he gave the guy the box. Well, the guard did not look in the box or anything. He just took it straight into the barge to the captain's quarters. Maxwell and his companion went back up on the bluff, and as Maxwell phrased it, they waited to see the effect of their work. At 11:40 a.m. on August 9th, 1864, a tremendous explosion rocked the waterfront. The barge that horological torpedo had been put on was a powder barge. It had 80,000 pounds of gunpowder on it. Now, black powder, the old black powder, is very slow burning. It's not just one quick boom and it's over with. This explosion lasted for 30 seconds. That's a very long time for an explosion. So stuff's flying everywhere. Muskets are flying everywhere. Cannonballs are flying everywhere. Debris from everything. So that barge had 80,000 pounds of powder, but it also blew other barges up. One barge had between 75,000 and 100,000 artillery rounds in it. They all blew up. Another barge had the artillery barge had 20 to 30,000 rounds of artillery shells, but the other barge had 75,000 to 100,000 rounds of small arms ammunition. So this is a tremendous explosion. Debris was thrown as far as a half mile in every direction. People downriver saw this smoke. They thought either Richmond or Petersburg was burning. A musket was found a half mile away, buried to the second band in the City Point Road, which was a dirt road. They said that one soldier could not pull that musket up out of the ground by himself. Another barge was loaded with old cavalry saddles. A very popular lemonade salesman was killed by a saddle flying through the air. So we know that at least, about 42 people were killed, many wounded, but I'm sure that the death rate was much higher than that, because all the freed slaves that went to the Union Army once they came through were working as dock workers. Well, they didn't keep muster rolls of the former slaves. So there would have been many more killed than what we know for sure. One of the gruesome things that I found out was they filled 11 barrels with just human flesh. So that will give you an idea of the force of this explosion. The other photo is looking, now that was looking upriver, this is looking downriver. You can see the destruction. And these photos were taken, I believe, 7 or 8 days after the explosion. Now here's where the crux of the explosion took place, right here. You can see everything's just mowed down. That right there is the axle of a cannon. So that cannon carriage was completely destroyed. There are many accounts that I came across of people that were there that witnessed certain things. Now, everybody thinks that the new ordnance wharf was built right after the other one was destroyed. That's not true. They rebuilt the one that was parallel to the waterfront. This was not built, so the one that they rebuilt was in August. They built a new ordnance wharf farther downriver, and instead of running parallel to the shoreline, it ran perpendicular out into the river. So that's the new ordnance wharf. That would have been built in October of '64. And here's a pile driver right there. That pile driver would drive the pilings down into the mudflats. So also, this is the coal wharf right here. This is coal. Most of the steamers would operate off of coal, especially in the Navy. The Navy did not like ships that burned wood. They wanted their steamers to be using coal. Now the locomotives could use either coal or wood. And look at all these. These are, back here you have a caisson, but the rest of these are just called limber chests. Limber chest is what's right behind the cannon with the ammunition in it. For a 12-pounder Napoleon, that would contain about 32 rounds. It would contain 12 rounds of solid shot, 12 rounds of spherical case, 4 rounds of case shot, and then 4 rounds of canister. Now a caisson, has 2 of them put together with a spare wheel. So caisson is not the same as a limber. And there's a view up close, and these are 12-pounder Napoleons right here. And there's a United States colored troop, that's what they called them back then. And so there were a lot of black Union soldiers at Petersburg. The largest use of black Union soldiers in the war was at Petersburg. Now there's a good shot of the 440. The reason they call it a 440 is you have 2 wheels here, 2 wheels there. So 4 if you count both sides, 4, 4, and then nothing in the back here. And then this one has wood in it. Those are water tanks. You can see the ordnance wharf way back here in the background. Up on top over here is the hospital for the railroad workers. Now these railroad workers were civilians. They had to pay for their own meals, but they were well-paid people. General Grant, as a lieutenant general, made $240 a month. The chief engineer for the railroad made $200 a month. A private, Union private, in July of 1864 made $16 a month. That railroad carpenter, he made $2.41 a day. He's making over $67 a month. So if you had a job in the railroad business back then, that was the top of the pile. It was the top of technology. Now the reason they had these water tanks is this type of locomotive could only go about 8 or 10 miles before you had to fill it with water again. So when you go down 460, all those little towns, Wakefield, Windsor, all those little towns are about 8 to 10 miles apart. That's because the railroad, Norfolk Petersburg Railroad, they had to stop about every 8 to 10 miles to refill up with water. So that's why you got all those towns going down through there. That railroad was built in the late 1850s. General Mahone, the Confederate general, he was the president of the railroad company. And I can't imagine a CEO of any organization going into the Army and being a general in a war in today's world. Now this is some of the railroad area again. This is the engine repair shop. It has 3 bays. Depending on what type of work they had to do to the locomotive, it could handle either 3 locomotives at a time or even 6 at a time. So instead of something breaking down and sending it back up north and waiting to be replaced, Grant wanted to have the capability of repairing whatever had to be repaired here. Because once stuff goes back up north, it's going to be a while before it comes back. He did the same thing for the troops too. If you're wounded, he built a bunch of hospitals around here. If it's a slight wound, you can go back into battle. But if it's a major wound, you could end up out of the Army or be sent to a hospital up north. These are the distribution barracks back here. That's where the railroad workers would sleep at night. And this is the car repair shop here. So the flatbed cars, the box cars, they would have issues, and you could repair them and keep them in operation here too. And also, this is a telegraph pole. So Grant had what they called instantaneous communication everywhere. So it was a relay system, You send it down the line, tap, 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 send it on down the line. When my dad was in the Army in the 50s, he learned it, he did the Morse code. So even 90 years later, we were still doing the Morse code. This is the engine repair shop from the side, but they had a turntable here to turn the locomotives around. They didn't have a steam engine hooked up to it. They did that by men. But it was on a pivot and so well balanced that it only took a few men to turn that thing around. And this is a photographer's wagon right here. And there's another view. I put this in for two reasons. The warehouses are still being worked on back here. The Union still, these are Sibley tents. There was a guy named Sibley, I think he became a general, and he designed that tent. He really didn't design it. He stole it from the Native Americans, and he got a patent on it, so he made a lot of money off of it. This railroad car, according to a couple of descriptions, they say it's Lincoln's railroad car. I don't believe it. There's no documentation in the military railroad stuff that I've gone through of any. They had passengers' cars brought down here, yes, but one just for Lincoln, there's no evidence for it. When Lincoln got on the train to go to the front, he just took one of the passenger cars. So there's no evidence that that was personally Lincoln's railroad car. And these next few shots just show some of the bluff area. But these are interesting. People say, well, what's all that stuff? Those are privies. Those are bathrooms. They dig a hole in the ground, then they would block it with brush and debris. So you can imagine the smells at City Point. This is the inner defense line at City Point. Now, these lines were built in 1862, actually in May of 1864. But this is Appomattox Street right here. So if you know where one of those fancy big houses, I think it's the one that looks like a Tudor-style house, there's still a bit of this earthwork still in existence right there. So the Tudor-style house is right here, and then the other brick house is right here. Now, Grant would eventually build an outer defense line, about 2.5 miles out from City Point. That was a result of the Confederate beefsteak raid. You might have heard about that. Well, the Confederates would wiretap the Union telegraph line. The Federals would wiretap the Confederate telegraph line. Most of the time, stuff is sent in code, but a lot of the times the Confederates just flat out sent what they were saying. And so with the Union, at one point in time, the Confederate telegraph guys they intercepted a message that Grant had 486 head of cattle at Coggins Point. Well, Jeff Stewart's gone by now, but his name just slipped my mind.
Wade Hampton.
Yeah, Wade Hampton, right. He came up with an idea. He said, well, General Lee, I can just ride around the Union Army coming from the rear and we can get some beef. Grant said, go for it. Lee said, well, Lee didn't really say go for it, but you know what I mean. Lee wouldn't have said something like that. Anyway, September 15th, I believe it was, 15, 16, 17, Wade Hampton goes south and then east, comes in behind the Federals, and over at Coggins Point, he captures 2,486 head of cattle. He also captures, I think it's the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry guarding the cows. He captures those guys too. And he drives them all back over into Dinwiddie County. And it's right there where White Oak Road comes into Route 1 is where they came to. They have so many cows, they had to bring them into Petersburg because they didn't have enough Army butchers to handle it all. And so the Confederates got to eat beef for maybe 2 months. And then I found an account too that on the picket lines, the Confederates would start chanting, where the lines were close and they could hear each other, the Confederates would start chanting, beef, beef, beef. That would get these Union guys kind of shaken up a little bit. Now this is the outer defense, well, I don't know which one it is. It could be the inner defense line because they had artillery in these positions too. But you can see these two pieces of artillery up here. It could be the outer defense line. The only original parts still left is there's Fort Abbott. I think it's around 21st Street. And then behind the elementary school, as you go out on 156, Fort Porter is still there. Now we get to the hospitals. Grant had 7 hospitals at City Point, but the biggest was the General Depot Field Hospital. This covered 200 acres of ground. It covered where the modern day, I still call it John Randolph, I don't know what the new name is. It covers that area, but it goes, for 200 acres around that area, this hospital covered that. It could handle in the summertime 1,200, it had 1,200 tents, and this is the summertime here, and they would be replaced by 90 log barracks. But get this, the survival rate was, once you made it to the Depot Field Hospital, your chances of survival was above 90%. You got to remember though, the #1 killer was dysentery. The #1 killer was disease. Only 3 out of 10 soldiers on both sides who died in the war died of cannonballs and bullets. 7 out of 10 would die of disease. That was even true as late as World War I. This hospital had plumbing. They had buried lines. Up here, you can see a water tank. They had 2 4-horsepower steam engines to pump water from the Appomattox up into those tanks. Now, they were not drinking the river water even back then. It was for cleaning purposes. And at the end of each street was a hydrant. And they had, I think they had like 4 highly paid plumbers that kept the water running. Keep in mind, plumbing was a brand new thing back then. So if you knew, even today, they still make a lot of money. So you knew they made a lot of money back then. This is just a photo where it's the same image on both sides. You can see that's part of the hospital, again in the summertime. This is where some of the officers were at. Now these are sunshades. A sunshade is just you put up some logs vertical and you put a few stringers across and then you go get some branches from somewhere and you have some shade, because it was a very hot summer. Sometimes I've seen accounts for these front lines. They write in their diaries, "too hot to fight." They call ceasefires on both sides because it's just too hot to fight, like probably today would be one of those when the heat index gets over 100. And then the end result, unfortunately, are the ones who did get killed. Most of the national cemeteries are soldiers killed in combat. So this is what's now the City Point National Cemetery. About 6,000 soldiers are buried there, not all of them from the Petersburg campaign, some of them from across at Bermuda 100. Now these are tents. This is a hospital, a small hospital in City Point. It was just for the garrison station at City Point. The Army guys stationed there, maybe a couple of thousand troops at the most. Now we get to, this is on the Appomattox, about where the yacht club is. That's where the medical wharf was. And I just saw a show on TV last week. You can't tell it, but up close, it says Planter on it. That's the name of that steamer. And there's a close-up of it. Well, I saw a show, I think it's called Mysteries of the Museum. And I normally don't watch Civil War stuff if it's not concerned with Petersburg or here. But I did watch it. And it's an interesting story. I didn't know this story about that steamer. Originally, it was a Confederate transport armed with artillery, and it was down in Charleston Harbor. Well, on the night of May 13th, 1862, this slave who was the helmsman. So you could call a slave a helmsman, but you could not call him a river pilot. That term was saved for the white guys. Anyway, this guy's name was Robert Smalls. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, he decided to make a run for it. The captain of the ship was on shore, and he had, I think it was about 8 or 10 slaves, and he started the steamer up. He decides that he's going to haul this, take off of this steamer. Well, the Union blockade is right outside of the bay there. So he goes in through the bay. He's going between all those batteries that Charleston had set up on both sides. With the whistle, he does the signal for whatever the signal was for passing through, so the Confederate artillery guys didn't bother him. He was flying a Confederate flag, and once he got out of the harbor, he took the Confederate flag down, ran up the white flag, and surrendered to one of the Union naval ships there. This guy ended up being the first black captain of a United States vessel. And he was a brave guy. He did something very similar to that in 1863. But he was in charge of this ship here at City Point. And I don't usually get too much into the Navy side of things, but I thought that was an interesting story. Another shot of the bluff at City Point. You remember the one I said was Prince Henry Avenue and that big white building? There's that big white building right there, so to give you an idea of where it was. And this is that building, the white building back there, that's the City Point Tavern. The City Tavern, as they call it, I think. Another view of the same area. A closer view of the waterfront. Now, I didn't talk about a lot of supplies did go out by the military railroad. About 15 to 18 trains made the run every day. But over 1,800 wagons left City Point carrying supplies to the Union Army. Another shot of the bluff up above. You can see a telegraph line pole there. These are some stables. They had about 800 to 1,000 farriers. Keep in mind, 63,000 horses and mules. This is Grant's horse, Cincinnati. This would be where the parking lot at the Epps house is today. A drawing of the waterfront. There's a monitor in there, not the monitor, but a monitor. They had more than one of those eventually. This is an E.L. Henry painting. He did his painting from the water because when he did come up on shore, he was arrested as a spy. Once he realized he was not a spy, he never set foot on ground again. He stayed out in the water. That's the earthwork at City Point. I thought this was interesting. There's a tree. They built this building around a tree. The tree's coming out of the roof of the building. A map the military railroad did at the end of the war. Grant's headquarters. Now he did have a cabin. There's the cabin right here. The one with the sun shining on it is Grant's cabin. The backside of it, a drawing. You can see how big that flag is. That was a garrison flag, gigantic flag. There's Grant, his wife Julia, and his son Jesse. And there's that chair that was probably taken out of the Epps house. This is interesting. It's a sketch, and what it is Grant didn't want his photograph taken at that point in time, but his wife says, now Ulysses, let him do it. It's the way he makes his living. It won't take but a minute. Mrs. Grant said that, so she got her way. She had the photo taken. This is Grant visiting the hospital, and up top, the soldier there is saying, good God, you're going to shake with me, Uncle Abe? And this is the end. Grant and his staff. Keep in mind, the most important piece of ground we have at City Point is where that cabin sits. That's where Grant conducted the war from. He was in charge of all the armies. So all his strategy took place right there. Lincoln visited in there. Lincoln and Grant were very similar in nature. They made jokes all the time. Lincoln once said he can only remember two tunes. No, Grant said he can only remember two tunes. One was Yankee Doodle and the other one was not. Whoops, I don't know what happened there. Well, that's it. I think I ran over time, but now you can see why the Federals would win the war. Any army that can do this in enemy territory is not going to be easy to defeat. Thank you very much. Oh, questions?
Who was the photographer? Alexander Gardner?
Gardner was here. Brady was here. A lot of Sullivan was here. There were many, many photographers here. Oh, I should be talking into this. Many photographers were here. Some of them I know who they were taken by. Some of them are just unknown. But City Point, I know of at least probably 100 photos taken, if not more than that. The Petersburg campaign is the best documented campaign of the whole war as far as photography goes. That's because they were here for so long, 9.5 months, and they knew it was history going on at that moment in time.
A follow-up lecture, are you going to consider Grant's Crossing of June of 1864?
Well, yeah, I mean, he built the longest pontoon bridge ever built. It was built in 14 hours, and about 2/3 of the Army crossed on the bridge. It was a half mile across, 101 pontoons, I think, and The entire cavalry crossed, and also all the supply wagons crossed. The supply train from the Pamunkey White House Landing to City Point was 35 miles long. That's how long the supply train was. Not a railroad train, just horse-drawn train. Yeah.
One more question. The Bonaccord, the 18th century house, is that,
No, the Bonaccord is the brick one. That was built in the 1840s.
is that a Fortress family seat house?
Oh, what?
Fortress family house?
No, the man that had it back at that time was Dr. Horatio G. Rutter was his name. The Epps did not own that house at that time. That house would eventually be owned by the Epps, but that's not until the 20th century. But a doctor named Rutter owned it. Let's see.
Union Army had about over 100,000 men. How many civilian laborers do you believe were executed for your?
I don't know the answer to that, but it's going to be several thousand for sure. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Jimmy, all the infrastructure that they put in, the rails, the
Yeah.
docks, the warehouses,
Right.
who got all that?
Okay. I think they built money at that time. It was over $250,000 worth of stuff they had there. The wharfs, the buildings. They built over 280 buildings. So when Epps comes back to reclaim his property, he's told that he has to buy all that federal stuff. But they only charged him $641. So he bought all that stuff, then he dismantled it, and he became the Lowe's of 1866. Because of all the need for lumber and everything to rebuild. So Epps made a lot of money off of it. They gave him a great deal. But he was a rich guy, you know. He's in the top 1% of society.
What about the rails and stuff?
The rails were left intact. The Federals would actually, now where there was a pre-existing railroad, the Federals left the railroads intact. Now where they would branch off of a pre-existing railroad, like cutting across from here over to say Richard Bland, where Warren Station was, they would pull all of that back up. But the Federals knew that the rail lines were these, it was like what we would call the interstates of those days. So they wanted the South to be rebuilt again, so they left those rail lines intact.
Quick story, Jimmy, when we were kids, before the Park Service took it over, that was our stomping.
Oh, yeah.
And we, during the centennial, from like 1960 to 64, 65, we dug up all kinds of stuff over there, and where we lived along the river and everything.
Right.
There used to be a shop downtown that this guy had, and we give him all the
Yeah.
stuff to put on display.
Right.
Went down there one time, he's gone.
Was that Perry's Corn Shop?
No, it was another site.
Oh, okay.
I don't even know who he was, but we all went down there one day because the centennial
Yeah.
was over. We cleaned out.
Oh, yeah. Well, I heard stories from Perry that he and Richard Epps, the one that lived here, you know, in modern times, that they had dug up a lot of stuff on the grounds there. We've done a lot of archaeology over there. Very little Civil War stuff comes up because I'm sure the relic hunters have already gotten all that. But every time you put a hole in the ground over there, you find Native American stuff almost every time. Yeah. One thing I want to let you know, the way they, say you had a locomotive and 10 cars making the run to the front. They kept track of the mileage of every single car and every locomotive. So if you got, say, 10 vehicles and you go 10 miles, that's 100 miles one way and 100 miles back. That's how they would keep their mileage records. They made so many trips during the siege. The final length of the railroad was 21 miles, but that's counting sidings and everything. The actual length is a little over 17 miles. By the end of the siege, they would log in 2,300,000 miles on that railroad. That's how many supplies would make the run in to the front. Keep in mind that it's not including all the horse-drawn wagons and stuff like that. One Confederate officer captured at the Battle of Fort Stedman at the end, that's March 25th, 1865. He still believed the South could win the war until he was taken behind Union lines. When he was brought back as a prisoner at City Point, he knew the war was over with. Right. The South had nothing like this going on, partly due to the decentralization of the South. And also it was just the industrial might of the North was the main thing. Well, thank y'all very much. Had a good time.